Good morning. Now we continue the review and summary and overview of Hemshech Ayin Beis, the conclusion. We are on page, in volume 3, we are on page 1457. Yeah. So let's just sum up what we've learned before we took the break. So we're learning about the neshamas as they come down below and all the dynamics involved. So on one hand, the neshama is rooted in the highest of places, all the way in Atzmus, Helma Atzmi, Shmaya Atzmi, higher than Torah, higher obviously than all of Seder Shtalshus, including Malachim. And yet, at the same time, precisely because the neshama is rooted so high, it is able to come down all the way into this world and fulfill the very mission and kavanah and intention of Atzmus, which is to make in the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu, God's desire to have a dira b'tachtenim dafke. And the tachtenim is not an illusion. It's a real concealment of the divine, not from God's perspective, but from our perspective. And as such, that needs to be dealt with. And since the neshama comes down into tachtenim, and namely into a body, a guf, and an nefesh abamis, an animal soul, which conceal its divine properties, its divine personality, as we've learned. So therefore, the neshama needs obviously avodah work to be able to reclaim or be able to reveal and access those higher levels all the way up to the root of the neshama. In addition, the neshama is also given siyua, support, the full support system of the Seder Shtalshus, which includes many different elements. What we're learning now is mostly about the malachim, the last pages. But before that, we learned about Torah, at least alluded to, and Ner Mitzvah also alluded to, which I brought into the picture because it's going to come later into Ayin Beis, and it's also from the Maimer HaMakbil Sheves. The Einei Ha'eda, that was very explicitly spelled out. The Sanhedrin, the leaders that are considered the eyes that guide us and direct us. And of course, the Malachim, also called Einei Hashem, the supervisors, or as we just called it, the cosmic support system, also sort of like the digestive system, etc. All the different ways he explained it, how the Malachim help support. But they don't do the Avodah for us. The work is still ours, and it's still the Neshama's own energy that's being revealed. It's not the Malachim's energy. It's not the Torah's energy. The Neshamas itself have it. So it's the ultimate paradox. On one hand, the neshama has tremendous potent power. On the other hand, it's concealed and needs an outside light, like the eyes need light today to be able to see in the dark. But then, as the neshama, through its Aveda, climbs and retraces the steps, it then, of course, reveals higher levels and higher levels, all the way up to the highest levels, and even beyond any revelation. In other words, even higher than what the neshama would have been had it not come down, which is what we're going to be, what we're in the middle of learning now. I'll get to that in a moment. And the process, the neshama also elevates the whole Seder Shtalshus, including the malachim, turning them from Oimdim to Mahalchim. That the malachim too benefit from this process, so they supported and illuminated us and guided, helped us, but at the same time, they received something in return, which is what the neshama achieved through the whole, elevating the whole Seder Shtalshus. Now, the final piece, which we're middle of now, comes down to this. So what happens? What about that very darkness that the neshama has to deal with when it comes down below? So that too plays a role. It's not just the darkness that the neshama overcomes through the siyua, through the support, and through its avodah, through its work, but actually that very darkness propels the neshama to places it would never reach on its own. So now the darkness itself has a role to play. Not just the role to fulfill the dira b'tachtenim, that we should have a home in the lowest of worlds, but it itself, as he began to discuss on page 1455, about the ishanen, the dark of the eye, the pupil of the eye is the main part of the eye, the shacher. So from the darkness, from the nefesh abamis, and all its challenges, that in a sense propels the neshama and to reach higher levels all the way, Ava Rabba and Ava B'tainugim, as he called it, which is higher than what the neshama has Lamaila in its even in the Gan Eden and the higher worlds. Like he said, Ishtaba Begufa de Malka. Later he uses the word Istakla Yikara de Malka, Istaklus Riya, which is the highest level of pleasure. And to explain that, began on page 1455, which we're now in the middle of, is the explanation of the verse, Shchera Ani V'Nava. I am dark but beautiful. And this is the neshamas below that are concealed, saying to the root above, to the neshamas lamaila, as he says, the neshamas am lebashas beguf la neshama kameshi lamaila, that even though I'm dark, due to the guf and nefesh habam, is that I am now so-called entrapped in, or that conceals on my energy, my divine energy and holiness. Nevertheless, I am beautiful. So to explain that, and the verse, complete verse, Shchera Ani V'Nava B'nei Yerusholayim. So this is a statement, Shchera Ani V'Nava, that is being said to B'nei Yerusholayim, which is the neshamas in their root. So the Rebbe Rasha began to explain what's B'nei Yerusholayim. First he explained Yerusholayim, Yerushalayim, the highest level of reverence and awe. There are lower levels, that's the highest level. And that is Dafke neshamas, have the capacity to reach that. Malachim don't have the capacity, because they're all part of the creation. And Bnei Yerushalayim is obviously the daughters of Yerushalayim, referred to Malchus of Atzilus, that, let's just say, Malchus the Kedusha. Yerushalayim is Malchus the Kedusha, and Bnei Yerushalayim is coming from that level, so it has that high level of Riyah and Yira, which is also the same letter as Riyah and Yira, as he explained, which is the highest level of the divine, of complete reverence, Yerushalayim. Yeah, Neshamas K'moshein Lamayla B'Bchinas Atzilus, they're called Bnei Yerushalayim. I'm just going over to just make sure I cover it all. Okay. Then he began to explain, okay, so how does the Neshamas from there come down to the lower levels in Biyah? So he gave the example, that's the difference between Ibur and Leda. Where the neshamas are in Atzilus, Malchus Atzilus especially, it's like a fetus within its mother's womb. So it's still feeding off and completely part of the mother. In this case, the mother here is Atzilus, as he explained on page 1456. The Leda is the neshamas as it comes out from the state of Ibur. What is apparently here is still Malchus of Atzilus before it goes into Biyah. And then there's the neshamas as it comes down into Biyah, which means essentially as the child becomes an independent entity and no longer is somewhat separate from Atzilus, there's stages in that too as it develops. And so that's the difference between the two stages. The neshamas as they are in their root, and the neshamas as it begins to come down into Bria B'fnei Atzmei, Yotzav v'Nifreda, like he says in Ageres HaKedesh Simachav. And for sure, even more separate as they come into Bria. So even though the neshama is still connected, obviously, but it's already taken the next leap. So to explain that, page 1456, and we're going to get from there to where we are up to now, he says, to understand that, let's understand the difference between Atzilus and Bria. Because that's the neshamas in Atzilus, and that's the neshamas as they come into Bria. We'll soon discuss the different levels of souls. But right now, he's just talking about the general difference between this journey. So what's the difference? It's that between them, there's a parsa, a mosach, a curtain, a partition. And briefly, the kav, which is the main power line, so to speak, from the oir before the tzimtzum, that comes after the tzimtzum as a narrow stream of light, a kav, a chut, which literally means a line and a thread. That kav, it ends, where does it stop? In Atzilus. Mistayim ha'er, till the parsa, meaning before the curtain, at the end of Atzilus, the bottom of Atzilus. And that which comes afterwards is already now a reflection, or reflection of a reflection, what he calls ha'ara nivdelis, a separate, it's like a leap. So it's a shift. And that's what a curtain does. It diffuses light. So even though it's the original light, but it's now in a different state. It's not the direct light. And even that which does pierce the parsa which is called Atzilus Shebebriya, which is the Kalim of Malchus that goes into Biyah, to Naran of Biyah, nevertheless, it's not like the Kav as an Atzilus. Okay. Now, he starts speaking about some differences. In Atzilus, he says, there is the difference between them as, one second. Oh, okay, so that's one difference. There's another difference between Atzilus and Biyah, that in Atzilus, everything's biskalus or ba'achdus. Obviously, it's interdependent on the first point. Everything is united. You sense that all-encompassing energy, what he calls afterwards, Eira El Al Kulona, the synergy. So you sense everything is part of one larger whole, which of course is Hashem Echad. Whereas in Biyah, you sense more the details. The details start becoming more defined and more prominent. He gave the example of Asara people, when a Kol Be Asara Shchinta Sharya, what the Shechina is there, and every Neshama has a Shechina within it. Because it's a Chelik Elikam Mal Mamish. So what's the difference between 10? Because there's a synergy that comes when people come together. There's something that's more uniting, that focuses on the general all-encompassing energy as opposed to the details themselves. Okay. Let's see here. So Atzilus itself is Achdus. That's the Eir al Kolona that we learned earlier. And now moving to the page we're up to, we're in the middle of this page. Actually, we finished the paragraph. So let me sum this up. So then, after explaining this second difference, that when it comes into Biyah, it becomes Madreges Protis, and this energy, this synergetic Eira El Al Kolona, like we spoke the example of Baruch, which is made up of Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf, but when they come together, there's a new energy, more than the sum of the parts. In Biyah, that is now diminished, so you see the focus is more on the details instead of how it is in Atzilus, the Achdus. And then he applies the same thing with Neshamas. That's the difference in Atzilus and Biyah. So now let's talk about the Neshamas as they are in Atzilus, Bnos Yerusholayim, and the Neshamas as they come into Biyah. So again, I'm summing up page 1457. So he says like this. Same thing we'll understand with the Neshamas. The way they come down to Biyah, even Atzilus of Biyah, it's not the way they are in Atzilus. In Atzilus, like we learned before, is a form of Ibur. They're completely encompassed like the fetus within its mother's womb. And there, you have the Eir HaKav itself, and that Eir Kloli that encompasses all the 10 spheres like we just learned. Mashenkin Kishayar de Libiyah, even Atzilus Shabiyah, the Eir is not like an Atzilus. So there we have now a distinction, which of course is setting the stage, what we're going to talk soon about Shcheira and Ivanova. Remember, the Neshamas, as they come down below, they become more and more concealed. Here, it's not totally concealed yet, because it still has awareness, but it's still not like an Atzilus. That's what he's saying. Now, the next section comes, it discusses different levels of Neshamas, because here the obvious question is, so all Neshamas are equal? All Neshamas start in Atzilus, or in the root of roots, all the way in Etzem, in the Atzmus. But we know there's a difference between the Neshamas of Moshe, of the Avis, Tzadikim, and so on. So that's what he addresses now in this last section, which we learned. He says like this: Yesh Neshamas, Yedua, that when you break it down, there's Neshamas that Atzilus Mamish. Then there's the Neshamas as they come into Biyah. Well, no, let me correct myself. There's Neshamas of Atzilus, and even as they come into Biyah, they retain their Atzilus personality. And that's the Moshe and the Avis. Then there's the Neshamas of Atzilus, Shebe Biyah. Like we learned in Biyah itself, there's Atzilus Shebe Biyah. So it's not Atzilus in Atzilus, or Biyah in Atzilus, but it's already Atzilus within Biyah, but it's after the Parsa. But it still has a Atzilus, let's call it energy. And then there's Neshamas de Biyah Mamish. So he literally breaks it into three categories. Neshamas that completely assume the properties of Biyah. They all originate in Atzilus. B'sheidish kulam hu ba'atzilus. They're all originate in Atzilus. The question is, how much are they affected by their journey as they come downward? So it goes both ways. All the neshamas come down, but some remain completely Atzilusdik. Some is Atzilus Shabiyah, some is Biyah Mamish. So in Kain, B'chol Neshama Yesh B'chinas Elu. Every neshama, even the ones that come into Biyah and become neshamas of Biyah, they also were once in a state of Ibur, meaning in the Bebet Na'im and Malchus of Atzilus. And he said that is reflected, mostly is revealed on Shmini Atzeres. That's the parentheses. With the bitl of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur comes into a state of settled in, it's absorbed on Shmini Atzeres. That's the level of Yiri law. And then there's the way they are in Leda, they give birth in Atzilus itself, and then they come in Atzilus into Biyah, and then to Biyah Mamish. So really there are 4 states here. 3 levels of Neshama, but 4 stages that he's talking about. The state of Ibur, the state of Leda. Ibur is still in Atzilus. Leda, but still in Atzilus. The state of Atzilus within Biyah, and then Biyah Mamish. And he compares that to the 4 things we learned Tahira, that we say every morning. Neshama shenesat bi tahirahi, barasa yitzarta ata nefachta. Tahira is the neshama as it's in the previous hakelim of Atzilus. Barasav is beriya sheba Atzilus. Yitzartav is already revealed Atzilus sheba biyah, but nefachta is biyah mamish. So those are the 4 stages, how he explains them here. They're explained in different places in different ways. Then, then he makes a distinction. Before he said the neshamas of Atzilus Mamish, even when they come biyah, they still Atzilus. He says either they are Atzilus Mamish or like Atzilus Sheba Biyah. And here in the parentheses, the last parentheses that we learned is, he said, Efsher, we could perhaps say this is the difference between Moshe and Avram. Moshe is Atzilus Mamish. That's why there's no psik taima, there's no line that separates between Moshe and Moshe. And Avram, there is a psik taima. So it still retains the Atzilus personality. That's why it's Atzilus Sheba Biyah. So Moshe is Atzilus Mamish, and the Shrimshus Rabbah Matoi Bechinas Atzilus Sheba Biyah. Then the final piece he spoke about Avram, which I might as well sum up already, according to the Zohar, that says, Basra Shlim, that Avram was complete, even as he came down below. So you have to say that even when he came down, he became a Markov of Chesed of Atzilus. That means through his Aveda, Nesala Nishmosel Likmoshi Batzilus Mamish. So in other words, he distinguished Avram as he is when he was born, so to speak, or the early part of his Aveda, I would say. And then how Avram elevates to Atzilus Mamish. Or like the second point we made, that it's all Isachdus and Assesses Sviris, like the Sefer Aboyer says, that Avram replaced Chesed of Atzilus down below. And that was through the Nisyanis, the tests. That's why we say that when we say that Avram reached Yira, the name Avram gave Yerusholayim was Yira. Why? Because Avram caught a Yira b'Nisayin and Akedah. He reached that level after the Nisayin of the Akedah. That's when he said Yira. Or Yira, like we said, both Riyah, vision, and the level of Yira Shlema, Yira Sholem, the level of complete reverence and awe. And that sums up what we learned. It was always worthwhile getting a summary. And here I'm ready now to continue in the next paragraph.
So when we're saying Neshama is the Atzilus, Atzilus Sheba Atzilus, not Atzilus Sheba Biyah. It is very few, right?
Here he says only Moshe, doesn't say anyone else. Well, first he says Moshe and the Ovis, but then he says Moshe and even Avram, not quite like Moshe, but Avram through the Nisayin, Nisayanus and Nisayin Akedah reached that level. He doesn't go into distinguishing them further, but there is definitely a difference between Moshe and Avram. Moshe, at the end of the day, is the ultimate because he's the one that received the Torah. He built the Mishkan. But We learned it also earlier. If you go back to page 1414, we also discussed the difference in Avram and Moshe. Yeah.
And
The
by
Moshe
Moshe
of every...
itself, there is a difference between a neshama Atzilus and a neshama of a Rebbe. This is a different thing, or
Well,
this is
as a
part?
Moshe b'chol David, a Rebbe is the Moshe of every generation. So in that sense, every Rebbe has a similar aspect. You're asking now how do you compare Moshe to every Rebbe?
No, I'm asking that in Olam Atzilus itself, there are two different types: a neshama Atzilus, Atzilus Atzilus, and is the Rebbe a different thing from a neshama Atzilus? That's what I'm asking.
He's not talking about a Rebbe here, but if you want to say that a Rebbe is this Pastrusa de Moshe, then you could apply whatever he says about Moshe to a Rebbe.
And one more question.
And remember,
the
difference
Sheresh,
is, just for the record, the difference is not in Atzilus. The difference is when they come down below. All neshamas are rooted in Atzilus. The question is, once it comes through the parsa, which is the partition, what happens? So in the neshama of Moshe, it's not affected. As Moshe was in Atzilus, that's how he was below. In Avram, it's Atzilus Shebiyah, or at least before the Nisyanis. And then there's the neshamas that become like Atzilus Shebiyah or Biyah Mamish. So the real difference between souls you really see after Atzilus, not in Atzilus itself. Even though obviously there's different levels, but that's how he explains it here.
that was my next question. In the Sheresh, everyone is equal, or even in the Sheresh, I understand after the Masach and everything is different.
Well, you
But
have to say,
before,
if you talk about Sherish Sharsham, like he called it, Atzmus, look, the fact that when it comes, why is one neshama affected by biyah and the parsa and another neshama is not? You have to say there's a difference in them, how they are in their root. But he doesn't go into the details here. This is another discussion which I'd rather not go into right now. So on one hand, you have to say that all neshamas are rooted in Atzmus. They are not even separate neshamas there. So when you say, for example, that a Rebbe is a neshama klolis, a nosi, like he speaks about in Ayin Beis, Reishon Shel Yisrael, like Moshe, and neshama klolis. So in a sense, he is the collective energy of all souls. So all souls are rooted there. So they're all rooted in the same place. The question is, as they move downward, so to speak, in the shtalshelus, what effect the shtalshelus has on them. So it's a sensitive question because, as I said, when they're all rooted, there's no separate neshamas in Atzmos. When you say neshamas are rooted in Atzmos, you're not talking about specific souls. You're speaking about the very concept of a soul. And there, everything is one, with the neshama klolis encompassing them all. But then as they travel, that's when the distinctions begin to manifest. That's how I would explain it.
thank you.
Okay, the new paragraph on page 1457, like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way down the page. And those that want to follow the text and don't have the sefer, you can look at ayinbeis.com, where all these pages have been scanned, PDF files. You can also print it from there if you like. Vihine. So now all this, which is actually relatively speaking for Chele Gimel of Ayin Beis, pretty expansive, because really breaking it down many different details. Obviously, it always needs more elaboration, but it's all setting the stage to understand the neshamas above, the neshamas below. As we're going to now, so as we're going to continue learning now. So this is going to go, as I said, for quite a few pages. We still have a few more pages all the way till basically 1462. So we have now another 5 pages in this topic. So he says like this: V'hine haneshamas. Now the souls, keshehein bebchinas ibor bebchinas malchus, nikrois b'nei Yerusholayim. He said earlier. The neshama says they are in a state of gestation, a state of pregnancy, gestation, which means they're all encompassed, just like uber, b'yimei imay, like a fetus in its mother's womb. As we learned before, it eats what its mother's. It's yerach imay. It's like a rib of the mother. It's a limb of the mother. In this case, what does it mean, beruchnius? that the neshamas are essentially an extension and a part of Atzilus. So that's called Bnei Yerusholayim. He's not coming back to the pasuk Shcheira and Ivanov. That's the level of Bnei Yerusholayim. Shebehem hu shleimus hayira. These neshamas in that level, they're Atzilus. So they have the shleimus hayira of Atzilus, which means the complete reverence and awe. Just one second. I want to see one thing. 1 second, please. That's why they're called Bnei Yerusholayim. The daughters of what? Of Yerushalayim. So it's the neshamas that have in them the state of consciousness is called Yerushalayim, complete, full reverence, awe. Mipnei, why? Because shemeir behem b'chinas hakav me'er ensof hameir be'eses v'yis da'atzilus. Like we learned before, the two distinctions of Atzilus and Biyah, because in them is radiating. The kav radiates in a direct way. It's before the parsa, it's before the curtain. So it's the power line, that main line called the kav, which goes all the way up from higher levels. Obviously, there are higher levels of the kav as well. But in Atzilus, you have a direct link to the kav, which from Ein Ein Sof, which radiates and shines within the 10 spheres of Atzilus. So the neshamas, therefore, are receiving directly that transmission. That's why there's that state of Shleimus Hayira. Al Kain hem b'b'chinas Shleimus Hayira, b'b'chinas Bittul Mitzias. That's why they're in a state of complete reverence, a state of Bittul Mitzias, not just Bittul Hayesh, which is Briyah. Bittul Mitzias means exactly like the Uber, like the fetus. It doesn't have any independent entity at all. Obviously, it is an Uber. It is something. You can't say nothing exists. But its whole being is encompassed and engulfed and submerged, you can say, within Atzilus. U'kamoi kain, and so too is it, who, b'neshamas da'atzilus b'chlal. So this level of the Eir HaKav that radiates Atzilus also, of course, affects the neshamas that are in Atzilus. The neshamas in general in Atzilus have this energy. V'gam b'chinas Atzilus shebebriya. Now he's adding, he's already emphasized that several times. So clearly he wants to make that an important point, that even that way the Atzilus is in Bria. Now remember, Atzilus in Bria is after the Parsa, but it still retains an Atzilus Dika energy. Like he said before, that Atzilus shebebriya pierces the Parsa. That's how the Kalim of Machzor Atzilus become Naran of Biyah. So this is a level which is like not quite pure Atzilus. It's Atzilus shebebriya or shebebiyah. So also that Li is the Atzilus ubchins gilem huz dalakus. Being that in Atzilus is the revelation of the very personality of Elikus, the Eir HaKav itself, not been diffused by the curtain, by the partition. So therefore, the neshamas in Atzilus are in that state. All neshamas have that element, but it was in a state of ibur. Once they're born, and once they come into biyah, I'm talking about the lower level neshamas, the neshamas in biyah, not the neshamas of Atzilus like Moshe or even Avram, Atzilus shebebriya. They all are in a state of ibur. All neshamas have that. But when it comes down below, once it's born, do they still retain that same energy? That's not the case with other neshamas. But neshamas of Atzilus do retain that, including the neshamas of Atzilus shebebriya. Okay, now there's going to be a parenthesis that's going to elaborate a bit more about this. And let's learn that inside. He says like this. Ukamoi, well, let me stop a second if anybody wants to ask anything about last few lines or anything I discussed till now. Okay. So the Rebbe Rashab is now spelling out what level this is. He says, Ukamoi, Gan Eden Elyon. So the level of Gan Eden Elyon, we know there's Gan Eden. There's two levels in Gan Eden in general, which really encompass many levels. Aden Ketz, it says in some places, unlimited, but generally Gan Eden Elyon and Gan Eden Atachten. Usually Gan Eden Elyon is the world of Bria, and Gan Eden Atachten is usually the world of Yetzirah. At times, Gan Eden Atachton is sometimes also Asiyah, just for the record. So he says, and Gan Eden Elyon is the domain. When you say a neshama goes to Gan Eden, usually means either Gan Eden Atachton or Gan Eden Elyon. So after Me'eva Esrim Shana, you say neshama went to Gan Eden, or the neshamas come from Gan Eden. So it's another way of saying Biyah. Obviously, in Biyah itself, or Bria rather, there's Gan Eden of Bria, and there's the rest of the world of Bria. We learned this earlier in volume 3, you may recall. We spoke about the difference between the Gan Eden in Bria and the rest of the world. Just like when Adam and Chava were created and placed in Gan Eden, the whole world was not Gan Eden. It was one part of the world that was Gan Eden. So there was a world, but in the world itself, there's a level of Gan Eden. It's a higher level of revelation. Same thing here. So Gan Eden Elyon, Shezo B'chinas Atzilus Shebebria. So that's the difference. Bria itself is called the world of Bria. Atzilus Shebebria is called Gan Eden Elyon. Or Gan Eden Elyon is the level of Atzilus Shebebria. Hari Hasogas HaNeshamas B'Gan Eden, U'B'chinas Hasogas HaMahus. The level of comprehension that Neshamas have when they're in Gan Eden is Hasogas HaMahus, which means they comprehend the very personality of the divine. When you say, for example, Yediyas HaMetzias, that's usually the contrast. Yediyas HaMetzias, you know that it's there. But if someone will say to you, can you explain to me what its personality is like, you say, I can't tell you. I just know that level is there. Similar to what we learned earlier about Malachim. Malachim can talk about godliness, but they say, Ayeh became Kvede. Where is the place of his cover? They know something's there, but they don't know it directly. Whereas Hasogas HaMahus means a comprehension of the very personality. I mean, you can find many examples there are people you meet that you know very well. And there are people you just know they exist, but you don't really know them well. I mean, just using a very practical, simple difference. So since Neshamas and Gan Eden is Hasogas HaMahus, that is how Neshamas and Gan Eden, which is Atzilus Shebebria. So that affirms what he said before, that an Atzilus or Atzilus Shebebria, you have Hasogas HaMahus. You have Bittul B'Mitzias, which is Yerusholayim. So he goes on. U'Kamoshin is barely ill, like we discussed, was explained earlier, and this is page, let's see here, 1211 and on. HaHefresh ben Gan Eden ve'Yam, that's what I was referring to before. The difference between Gan Eden and the world. When you say there's a Gan Eden, you mean in the world itself, there's a level called Gan Eden. So clearly Gan Eden is a higher level than the rest of the world. So that's what he discussed there. That in Gan Eden is a special revelation. So Bria itself doesn't have quite that level. Because the Parsha completely conceals that level of Ur. But the level of Gan Eden in Bria, Gan Eden Elyon specifically, still retains that Atzilus Dika awareness. That's why Neshamas have Hasogas HaMahus. It's still not the way it is in Atzilus Mamish, but it's more than it is in Bria Mamish. U'Makol Mokim, and nevertheless, B'china Ziv Teirosan V'Avidosan, now he's going to distinguish that Neshamas are even higher than Gan Eden. Nevertheless, this reflection, Ziv Teirosan V'Avidosan, Ziv is usually reflection. So this Ziv, or the Oir, you can say, the light of their Torah and their Avodah of Neshamas, Hulamayla Habim Gan Eden Atzmei. Because now you'll say like this. So one second, if Gan Eden is a high level of revelation, higher than Bria, and the Neshamas are learning Torah and serving Hashem through Ava V'Yira, there's no physical mitzvahs there. In Ruchnius, so what do you mean? You say they're in Gan Eden, fine, it's a higher level, but the Neshamas themselves are doing something more than Gan Eden. Like we learned there, if you recall, that when Adam and Chava were placed in Gan Eden, God had planted many trees there. But their job was to now cause that vegetation to grow. Let's say the garden to blossom. La'avda l'shamra. That means they took Gan Eden to even a higher level. So there's Gan Eden that's higher than the rest of the world. That's the way God created it. Then there's the Neshamas, as they do their work in Gan Eden, they reach even a higher level. That's what he's saying. That's higher. Because Gan Eden is the level of Atzilus within Bria or within Bria, which is only the reflection of the kav. Ubefrat b'chinas Atzilus shebabiyah, and specifically Atzilus within biyah. Now, what does he mean by reflection? It's still a reflection of the very kav. It did not go through the curtain, or at least not in Atzilus mamish. Or even when it goes through the curtain, it still retains the Atzilus personality. She'ein zeh kamei b'Atzilus kanal. That's not like it is in Atzilus mamish. Ubederech klal hu gili muhus haziv. Okay, I'll explain that in a moment. Let me just finish the parentheses. And generally, that's the revelation of the personality of the reflection. By Teda mitzvahs, through Teda mitzvahs, nimshach muhusa etzem. But through Teda mitzvahs is the avodah of the neshamas. You draw down the very personality of the etzem, not just of its reflection. U'komishon is bar le'il, as was explained earlier, on page 1454 and on. I'm giving you the sources if you want to look them up. So really, there's now three levels here. There's I mentioned before that there's two ways to know somebody. You can know somebody exists, but you don't know anything about them. And then you know their muhus, you know their personality. He's adding now another level. There's muhus haziv and the muhus ha'etzem. So although he only says it briefly in 4 words, let me explain the difference. I'll use a scientific, I'll use an example from the sunlight. So we see sunlight, and we all benefit from it every day. The light shines to this earth. It illuminates the world. It also brings warmth and all the other blessings that the sun brings to us and the different forces. So a lay person, like each one of us, we know this sunlight. We don't know much about it unless we study it. So now somebody studies the sunlight, a scientist, and they can begin to examine it, evaluate it. And when they do, they get to understand its personality. What is this light like? What is light made of? Is it made up of particles? Is it a wave? And all the different things that scientists try to understand what light is. But this is still only a reflection of the sun. It's not the sun itself. Then there's another study. The sun, the source of the light. That would be, in this example, Muhusa Etzem. So again, we see the Mitzias Hashemesh, everybody sees there's a sun. But we don't know the Muhusa Hashemesh. Now, is the Muhusa Hashemesh different than the Muhusa Ziv? Absolutely. As much as you understand the personality of sunlight, which it could be quite profound, then there's a whole thing, where does the sunlight come from? That's studying the sun itself. That's a simple physical example. So the same thing with Elikus. You could have Yediyas HaMetzias, you know there's godliness in existence. Nothing creates itself. Everything has divine energy within it. But you may not know much of its personality. You start learning Chassidus. You learn Mayim, water, is a reflection, is a physical manifestation of a parallel of Chesed. Chesed of Yasiyah, which evolves from Chesed of Yitzida, from Chesed of Bria, all the way Chesed of Atzilus. What do you know about it? The more you learn about that reflection, so to speak, and you can get to know the personality of Chesed. But that's not necessarily the Etzem yet. Because the Etzem could be the Etzem of Chesed, or what about the source of Chesed, which is the Eibishter himself, which is the one that emanated the attribute of Chesed. That's a whole other study, the Mehusa Etzem. So there's a Mehusa Ziv, there's a Mehusa Etzem, and then there's Mitzias. He doesn't emphasize the word Mitzias. I'm bringing that in just for contrast purposes. So what he's saying is like this. The world of Bria itself knows the existence of the divine. A Gan Eden within Bria knows the Mehusa Ziv. So it's a higher level because it knows the personality, but it's still of the reflection of the Kav. And through Torah mitzvahs, the neshamas reach the level of knowing Mahus Ha'etzem. Mahus Ha'etzem. Like similar to the examples I've given about the artist. You come to discover that this whole world, which is divine art, so you come to learn there's an artist that created this art. But what do you know about this artist? Not much until you learn more. And you learn that there's an artist. You learn about the artist. But then we come to understand the artist himself Rather, the Eibishter is not defined by being an artist. That's only one aspect of him. There are things about him, his muhus, that are completely nothing to do with art. Meaning, being loizeh ikar elikus, that's not the primary thing of God, is to be a creator. That's one thing he could do, but it's not defined, does not limit or define him. So just as examples to understand how you can have muhus of a ziv, you can understand the personality of a reflection of something, which is higher than just knowing that it exists, the reflection, or seeing it, and the personality of the etzem itself, which is even the source of the ziv, of that energy. This is briefly an explanation, even though here it's very dense, this piece at least, he doesn't elaborate, but I just wanted to spell it out, which helps us understand, obviously, the different levels of our journey in our Avodah, where we stand, and everything is relative to where you are. So all this is applicable to each one of us based on our level.
Can you take a question?
Yeah.
I was just to clarify what you just explained. I think you said there is essentially at least 3 levels. One is to understand.
I spelled out three. I said 3, yeah.
And the final highest level was Etzem itself, or Atzmus, if you will.
I don't want to use the Atzmus. I said Etzem,
Etzem.
Muhusa Etzem. Atzmus not necessarily here, but Muhusa Etzem compared to the reflection of the Etzem. The sunlight compared to the sun.
So Mahusa Etzem is the highest, and Mahus Haziv is the second highest. And what's below that?
Just knowing that it exists without knowing it's Mahus.
Uh-huh. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Mahus Etzem is Atzilus Shabbat and Mahus Ziv is Atzilus Shabbat.
Not what he's saying here. Here he's saying in Bria itself, you have Bria. Gan Eden is Atzilus Shabbat, that's Mahus Aziv. And the Neshama is through the Torah mitzvah, through their Veda, reach Mahus Etzem because they're receiving straight from Atzilus.
Yeah, I think, yes. I think that's what I said, but yes.
Okay. Valkain, and therefore, after the parentheses, the neshamas have begilim muhus alakus. That's why they're in the state of Bnos Yerusholayim. Because when you have that level of awareness and consciousness of the Mehusa Etzem, it brings to Shleimus Hayira utter bittul, utter what he calls full, complete or full reverence and awe. Now comes another parenthesis, which is a little, I'll read it. V'ayim asher kosav al-maimer hazeh chai sorah. Dav kuf lamed beis omid aleph. So now he's referring us to Biyuri Hazayar, which is from the Tzemach Tzedek. I see I have marked here. Volume 2, page 649. So he explains that Zayar chai sorah, be'inyan v'hinei Rivki yitzas, where he talks about Rivka, when she came out, when Eliezer came to find a shidduch for Yitzchak. So it says Rivka greeted him, she came out. So 6, what does the Yitzas means? So he explains there, the Neshamas HaGvoyis, HaKlolis, that the highest, the great, the lofty souls, HaKlolis, meaning the all-encompassing souls, Shehem B'chinas Merkava, which are in a state of Merkava, like a chariot or a vehicle to Elokus, like the Ovis would be an example. Hine Ba'alos Mashalahem, through their Aveda, Hariyem Nechlolim Mamish B'chinas Malchus. So what is achieved? If they're already a Merkava before their Aveda, what does the Aveda do? It says that causes them to be encompassed completely into Malchus, Ubehem Mamish Hu HaYichud, and with them itself, the Yichud happens in them directly, and Shemer B'hem Chinas Shem Ma'ad Atzilus. The Shem Ma'ad Atzilus radiates within them. And obviously, to understand this piece, you have to go learn it in the Biyuri Hazeh. The Rebbe Rashab, in his thoroughness and grounding the idea, wanted to make sure that we have more sources to look up. He's not really explaining what he's just stating what it says there, But this is not uncommon, as we've learned many times. It's like a support to what he's saying. Look there, and you could see again the difference between a high-level soul and through Avodah that it reaches even a higher level.
I thought that Shema Atzilus is Chachma, not Malchus.
Well, it doesn't say here the word Chachma, but sometimes Ma can be referred to Chachma. But Ma could be the general Atzilus, is Shema, because Chachma dominates in all of Atzilus. So he's not going into Chachma or not. He's just saying Atzilus.
Right, but he said...
In contrast to Malchus.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's absorbed into Malchus Atzilus, but then he called it Shema, which I, again, thought was Chachma.
Maybe, maybe not. I don't know if he means Chachma here. It could be he means Atzilus in general.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, you can look it up in the Biur Azer if you
like. I'll take a look. Oh, it's Biur, but not in the Mimer of the Samach Tzedek. Okay.
Samach Tzedek, Biur Azer
refers to it. Okay, yeah, got it.
It said volume 2 of the Biur Hazer of the Samach Tzedek. There's a Biur Hazer of the Mittler Rebbe. There's a Biur Hazer of Samach Tzedek. Two different books.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Volume 2, page 649.
49.
649. Okay. This is all the neshamas as they are rooted in Atzilus, and they go Atzilus Shebebriya, Gan Eden, and so on. Avol Kamoisha Yarda Neshama. I'll just go a few more lines just to get the flow. But as the neshama now, by contrast, that's Bnei Yerusholayim, what we discussed. But the neshama doesn't stop there. Remember, the neshama comes down and is going to be speaking to Bnei Yerusholayim, to its root. So when the neshama comes down, next page, 1458. And now it assumes the properties of Bria, or becomes the level of Bria. We're talking about neshamas that don't retain their Atzilus personality. They're now coming into Bria. Ein bo shleima sayira. They don't have shleima sayira, that level of reverence, that complete reverence. That's why I used before mitzias. Their comprehension of the divine is only the existence of the divine. They know it's there, but they don't know its personality. Now, just for the record, when you know something's there, you can't say you don't know anything. Something is there. There's people who don't even know it exists. The fact that you know it exists, you can't say there's no mahus at all. This says another Maimarim. But it's not really understanding the full personality or a big part of the personality. So this is now Metzias Levad. That's in Bria, the Kolshkein. And furthermore, and even more so, for sure, as a soul descends below, and now we're going all the way down below, not just Bria, in comparison to Atzilus. And is enclosed or manifests within a body and an animal soul. Like he used that expression, that comes now into a more material, it's materialized, it's concretized. Akshama really means more defined, more tangible, more megusham. Not necessarily a negative way, but more defined and more congealed. Another word you could use. In other words, like think of gas turning into liquid, turning into ice. It gets solidified. But in our context, it gets more connected to the material, that definitions that we can relate to. When we talk about Atzilus, pure Atzilus, it's very abstract compared to our understanding, because we are tangible people and tangible human beings of flesh and blood. When we look at things with eyes of flesh, and so on. So now the neshama is coming down, a gufa nefesh habamis b'akshama achenit fesas b'yeshes, to the point that is contained by. Nitfesis, we've used that word many times. It means to be grasped by, but also it means that it is affected by the yeshes. So you could have a light, for example, that shines. Chassidus gives the example: sunlight shines on a garbage pile, just like it shines on a palace, on a pile of diamonds, because it's not affected. Light is not affected by where it shines. But then there's hislapshus. That's because it's makif. That's because oir does not enter internally. But a neshama is not like that. A neshama enters into the body and the animal soul. It becomes one with them. Not one that it loses its identity, but it now is affected, like we've learned about how the pain, mikre haguf, the affairs and the experiences of the body affect the soul, at least the lower levels of the soul. So the neshama is nitfesas b'yeshes. Yeshes means, well, yeshes can mean subtle yeshes, it can mean crass yeshus, but essentially means body, substance is the word I would use here, substance. Whereas the neshamas above don't have quite that substance. And furthermore, it goes even ubafrat, and specifically aidei halomis v'astedim, the nefesh habamis. This is just the mere fact that the neshama comes into a body. Even a newborn child, the neshama has now come down into a physical body, as opposed to when it was in the state of ibur, if you wish, or even prior to that. But now they're talking about the concealments and the covering ups, the coverings of the animal soul. The nefesh habamis, when it starts, its interests are about material pleasure and so on. That creates a concealment that conceals on the energy and the light of the nefesh halikis, as we've learned at length. This is back to the same themes also in Magbil Shevis of the Maimer Mik Hashem Elkeina Magbil Shevis, how the psila, the wick, comes down into the animal soul, and there is a level of concealment that affects it. So, let me just read, because he's going back to Shcheirani. I'll read a few more lines, even though we'll go. V'zeu Shcheirani. Now he's going back to the original point. Now we understand the neshamas above, Bnei Yerusholayim, and the different stages that we discussed. And as it comes down below, it's in stark contrast. It's not in the state of Yerushalayim. First in Bria, it's not in that state. Then as it comes down to Guf and Nefesh Habamis, then the Halamas was stadium of the Guf and Nefesh Habamis. So V'zeu Shcheirani, that's what the neshama says. And the Biridosa Lamata, because in its descent below, the soul's descent below, he b'chinas shachrus v'helim. It's in the state of darkness and concealment. Shenechshach eira, its light has become darkened. Ube'en areich legamri, and it's infinitely distant, very far apart. From the way the neshama was l'mayla, where it's called the daughters of Yerushalayim. And nevertheless, the neshama says, even though I've become darkened like this, and I'm so distant from the way I am in my source, saying it to Bnei Yerushalayim, nevertheless I am beautiful. Because dafka, specifically through the soul's descent below, something is achieved in it. What the neshama above does not have. In other words, it has something even Bnei Yerushalayim does not have. Because when it comes down below, nasis b'chinas kala loshen kaloyin, it becomes the level of kala, which means a bride, but it comes from the word kaloyin, which means total. Kaloyin means complete losing itself, dissolving, or being absorbed. Hainu teikef atshukev atzimoyin. But kaloyin means not the absorption part, that it has that tremendous thirst, the intense chukah, yearning, b'tzimoyin, and thirst b'yesed, increasing its thirst. Shabam min arichuk dafke. So what it's achieved when the neshama comes down so below, and it senses its distance, that creates a tremendous passion. You could say kaloyin here may even be called passion if you wish. Kaloyin usually means to be absorbed, like kaloyin ha-apsila in the fire when the wick is becoming absorbed in the fire. But here, the absorption is...
Klois ha-nefesh. Klois ha-nefesh. Same thing.
He doesn't use that word exactly right now, but he's using the word more tzemoyin. I want to be careful, because klois ha-nefesh can be a different level than this. Min harichuk dafka u'kamei shekasav mizmer leDavid b'yeseh b'midbar Yehuda. That's David saying, dafka when he was in the midbar, the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, but midbar dafka, samalacha nafshi, was dafka in a midbar, which is an arid desert, a wilderness. Samalacha nafshi, my soul thirsts to you. Be'eres siya v'oyef, in a dark and siya. What does he translate siya? I don't remember now. V'oyef, bli moyim. In a parched land, and v'oyif, like tired, arid, even bli moyim, without water, dafke. The be'eres siya bli moyim, in a parched or arid land without water, she'ena er v'gilisham, where there's no revelation and there's no light. Sham dafke Nasa atzamayim b'yeser. After there, this great thirst is developed. So that's what the Vanova is, the great thirst that comes from the Shcheirani. So it's not just despite the darkness, I am beautiful. It's actually the darkness on one hand is dark, but on the other hand, that itself, it propels and causes the soul to be so thirsty, and therefore Vanova is so beautiful, as we're going to learn in the next paragraphs what that means, Vanova. But that's that generally now. So summing up what we learned, it began Shcheirani on page 1455. So now in a way he's tying it together on 1458, these last 3 pages, by explaining first Bnos Yerusholayim, how the neshamas are above, Shleimus Hayira, how they come down below, and even though they're darkened and concealed, Vanova, a beauty that the neshamas above don't have, this type of thirst, a soul above never has, because it doesn't feel such distance. Okay, we'll stop here. Any questions? End of the top paragraph on page 1458.
So I think that we previously discussed the Mila, the advantage of the neshama for coming down below to Asiya, even over its station, its merit in its original source in Atzilus, being essentially that what you just said, but also as in Balabatisha terms, in practical terms, it's the adversity that we face, that the neshama faces in this world of materialism and darkness, concealment of godliness, godly light, that it's in that very adversity where the soul becomes greater, because it feels that that thirst, and that it sees or feels the absence of Elikus, or the seeming absence of Elikus, and it strives to bring Elikus into that dark place, and that makes the light, the godliness feel relatively that much greater, because it's more appreciated in a place where it's seemingly not existent, as opposed to a place where you sort of, I guess you take it, and this is a gross, coarse language, it'll become used to it, take it for granted, because you don't know anything, it doesn't know anything else. Is that a fair Balabatisha? I don't know.
Partially on one way to explain it. It's not the only way, but yes, that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? So we'll stop here, end of the paragraph.
I just want to say that was an extremely helpful explanation of Shorani Vanava. I mean, we did learn it before. We've learned it a couple times, but that was the most exquisite and refined and really beautiful elaboration of the subject. And I personally feel like I understand it 10 times better than before. So thank you.
Yeah, well, you thank the Rebbe Rashab, but there's going to get even more exquisite in the next few pages. He's just getting into it.
We're at the climax.
All the way to page 1462. He's going to continue explaining this now in the next section. But we'll stop here. Thank you for that.